Well, it's 12:02. We've got a number of folks in the room. I'm so pleased to have you all here today. We also have Sharna Goldseker and Michael Moody, and I think I'm going to go ahead and officially begin if that works for you all. Thank you for joining Skystone Partners today for our first installment. This is the inaugural episode, so to speak, of On Giving, Incisive Commentary and Analysis at the Intersection of Philanthropy and the Greater Good. I'm Liz Newpel, President and CEO of Skystone Partners, where we believe philanthropy is a powerful force for good. I'm proud to welcome you, dear guests, as well as our speakers today, Michael Moody and Sharna Goldseker, two of the most prominent experts in next generation philanthropy. We'll learn about their research from their 2019 AFP Skystone Partners Prize for Research winning book, which you'll see right here. Generation Impact, How Next Gen Donors Are Revolutionizing Giving. But before we begin our conversation with Sharna and Michael, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping items, folks. First of all, format. We'll have some discussion, some conversation with Michael and Sharna about their research and findings, and then we will have a few minutes for select questions from you before we wrap up the overall conversation. If you'd like to ask a question, please note right now you're typing in the chat to say hello. We're going to be shifting things over to the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your bar. You can see that right there, and we'll be closing up the chat option before too long. So just know that the chat option will be turned off. Our question moderator, Senior Consultant Bill Mulvihill, will receive your questions, and he'll be curating a number of them so Michael and Sharna have the opportunity to answer as many as they can without too many duplicates. So Bill is behind the scenes right now, but he'll join us for our Q&A session. So down to business. Today, we'll meet the next generation of big donors, the Gen X and millennial philanthropists who will be the most significant donors ever and will shape our world in profound ways. Of course, we have with us here today Sharna Goldseker and Michael Moody to discuss their work on the question that's on everybody's mind, which is how do we reach this next generation of donors, and will they support what their families have historically supported? Sharna is a speaker, writer, consultant, and today's leading expert on multi-generational and next generation philanthropy. Dr. Michael Moody helps people navigate today's complex world of giving and social innovation. He holds the world's first ever endowed chair for family philanthropy, the Frey Foundation Chair at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. Michael and Sharna, welcome.
Oh, thanks very much for having us.
Very good. Glad you're here. Okay. So let's begin with a little bit of level setting. And actually, Michael, I'd like to begin with you.
Okay.
When we talk about the next generation of donors, I find that it's good if we all kind of know what the category is we're talking about. How do we define them? Who are these? What is this elusive bunch that's going to change the world?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thanks for having us in this. It's an honor to be the sort of inaugural speakers in this, and also again, thanks. We both, I'm sure, want to say thanks for supporting the Skystone Partners Research Prize through AFP, and we're just really honored to put it right there in the top of the reissue of our book and everything. So yeah, it's great. So next gen donors, there's a broader category. And then there's the category that we're really focused on, and I'll say why we're really focused on this more a smaller subset. But the general idea is that when we talk about next gen, which is always, if you're a fundraiser or you're somebody who worked in a family foundation or in any way connected to philanthropy, you know that the next gen is always a perpetual question. Who are the next generations coming up? Right now, in this historical moment, which is an incredibly unique historical moment because of the amount of wealth that's being created, the dramatic changes that are happening in the field of philanthropy, the innovation that's really experimentation that's going on, the way fundraising profession is changing. We really want to focus, okay, well, who's the next gen now? So we're really talking about people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who are coming into their own as philanthropists right now. And like I said, there's a broader category, which includes a lot of people across the economic spectrum, a lot of, there are a lot of millennials who are beginning to become your annual donors, some older Gen Xers who are starting to move into that role of, major donors, or certainly have been your donors for a while. And now even Gen Z who are becoming adults. And we're at a time when people are living longer and more people are getting involved earlier. So there's more generations involved in the field of philanthropy that you have to address as a fundraiser earlier in their lives. And so really the focus is really about mostly for us millennials and younger Gen Xers. And our research really focuses on those who have the capacity, who are in those generations who have the capacity for major giving, for significant contributions, whether that's through an inherited a role in a philanthropic vehicle, or through inherited money, because we know that we're in the midst of the greatest wealth transfer in history, or through creating their own wealth. And as we know, those who are creating their own wealth, Gen Xers and millennials, they're getting involved in philanthropy very early in their lives. And so they're starting to think about, what kind of a philanthropist am I going to be? What kind of a major donor am I going to be? So when we talk about next gen today, that's really who we're talking about, are those Gen Xers and millennials who have the capacity for significant giving, who are really just starting to figure out and trying to, lean into and learn into their philanthropic identities as big donors.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, this brings me to another question. And actually, Sharna, I'd like to ask you about this. When we think about what Michael just said about how we're defining, when we talk about this generation impact, why does this generation of philanthropists, as they're coming into their own, feel the need to differentiate themselves from previous generations, and what do they do differently?
So previous generations in their minds gave out of a sense of duty or loyalty or obligation, right? Really committed perhaps to their friends or their neighbors, like a personal relationship, maybe motivated from their tax write-offs. And they're sort of saying, that's admirable, but really my first priority is impact.
Okay. And what does impact mean when we're talking about these donors?
So Michael and I like to say they're obsessed with impact, right? They really want to understand how they can make a difference through their giving. And that we can talk about sort of giving in a broad sense, whether it's time, talent, treasure, or ties, but they want to understand how they're making a difference, and they want to see that difference. So right. How does their hands-on involvement, participation, engagement, whatever the word is you want to use, have an effect on the organization and the mission that they're supporting, right. The cause that they care about. So they're prioritizing impact over everything else, from the recognition that previous generations perhaps wanted for their giving, or the, seat on the board, all things that I think leadership criteria of traditionalists and baby boomers perhaps isn't as much of an appeal to the Gen Xers and millennials who we've interviewed and surveyed, and instead really saying, I want to be on the ground. I want to understand what the needs of the nonprofit professionals on the ground are, and how our contributions can make a difference.
Right. That's great. And it's that word impact. And one of the words that I heard again, or I read again and again in the book, was revolutionize. And in fact, it's right here in the title. And so that kind of depth, is a little bit different than what we've experienced so far. And either Sharna or Michael, whoever would like to hop in and answer, they want to know how their skills are helping. They want to know how their time, talent, treasure, ties are helping. But what might that look like in an example kind of a situation?
Michael, maybe I'll start on innovation if you want to jump in from there. I think that they're observant that we interviewed Daniel Laurie, for example, who started the Tipping Point Foundation in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he went back to his hometown to really address issues, hunger, homelessness, things that are sort of bedrocks of our charitable sector. And he said, you can't keep doing the same things and expecting different results. Like, these are persistent challenges that we're facing. And how do we really focus on the strategies that are moving the needle and make a difference? And Daniel talked to us about how for-profit corporate organizations would fund R&D grants. And so why couldn't he help support innovation grants to the nonprofits so that they too could try something different and take a risk and experiment to see what would move the needle? And so I think this is like a good metaphor for really how NextGen are open to innovation and risk-taking and experimentation, maybe getting at that word revolutionizing that you're talking about. We like to say they're not bomb throwers. They're just trying to revolutionize the process of giving so that they can find the ways that are most effective for advancing change. So, whether that's Justin Rockefeller, who we interviewed, he and his sister, Valerie Rockefeller, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the investment committee there decided to divest from fossil fuels, which is how the family made their wealth, in order to reinvest in things that were more in alignment with the climate change they were funding on the grant making side, right? Or we have people who are interviewed who set up C4 organizations saying for the first time, we would even not take the tax deduction to advance through advocacy or policy change. Someone we interviewed or surveyed more recently after COVID hit, they're funding loans to give bridge money to organizations who might have revenue coming in sort of after the pandemic when the services will start back up. So they're just open, I think, to operating grants even more than program grants, again, to not need to put their name on things. So just willing to experiment, take risks, revolutionize the typical approach to check writing in order to make an impact.
Great. I love that. And I know, Michael, you're involved with social innovation. How does this sort of coincide, this desire to innovate, to experiment, to maybe allow a little space for failure? How does this work together with the donors and with the organizations? What are they seeing?
Yeah, so I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that we're in an interesting time in this field. I think everybody thinks that they live in interesting times, but we actually are living in a very interesting time. There are things happening in, especially at the highest levels of philanthropy, that are changing the norms that have been norms really we've had for decades. Up to this point. And the next generation is really excited about that. I mean, like I said, imagine if you're, somebody who's sort of inheriting a role in philanthropy through your family, or you found yourself able to be a donor at this, and make significant changes as a donor, and you're starting to think, okay, what would I really want to do? You coming into the field, you're starting to think about your identity in that field, and you realize, oh, this field is actually really changing. There's an ability for me to do things differently. I don't just have to do what everybody has done in the past, which is create a foundation, make as much money as I can during my lifetime. Then when I retire, I move into this role in a foundation, and I get, and all the traditional things that you do. Many of those things are continuing. I'm not saying those are going to go away, but they're really enjoying the idea and embracing the idea that the envelopes are being pushed in this field. And so they're trying new things, and that frankly, you can take risks. Philanthropy in general is a very risk-averse field traditionally, but the next generation really wants to push that a little bit. And what that looks like is like I said, it's not as though they're getting rid of all the traditional ways that we do things. It's that they in some ways want to try new things in addition to that. So if they're part of a family, they continue to want to give to those legacy institutions that the family's always given to, which is good news for people who fundraise for those institutions, right? But they want to maybe do that in a different way. Instead of, there's a person that tells her story in the book, because the book contains 13 stories that people write up themselves, including Daniel Laurie and Justin Rockefeller, you've already heard about. One of them is Catherine Lorenz. And she said, my grandfather was interested in the name on the outside of the building, the bricks on the outside of the building. I'm interested in what goes on inside the building, and what are the programs happening, and how can I work with them directly, roll up my sleeves and get to work with them on those programs. And so it may look that it more like a different way of engaging with those partners that they fund, rather than they want to throw out all grants to those partners. Well, they still want to maybe give to the hospital, but they want to give to in this really engaged way where they're helping to start a new program, or they're being asked to come in and contribute their talents, not just write a big check, but in addition to that, come in and provide their talents as a marketing expert or as an IT person or whatever it might be. So the innovation doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting rid of grants and they're only giving loans, or they're only doing impact investing and they're going to get rid of the foundation. Often it's more they want to change how they engage and relate with those institutions that they're really connected to.
Right, right. And so what I think I hear you both saying is the innovation with this next generation of donors is actually a fairly interesting opportunity, because the old way, I'll put up the air quotes, so to speak, the old way isn't vanishing. And in fact, so many of these next generation donors really value what their families have historically supported. It's just that the portfolio of options for the way that they are making financial contributions or supporting those of us who work for the greater good, there's just a wider range of things, which is, I guess, an opportunity for professional development for us all to learn about. Michael, is that?
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to over emphasize how, they're going to, it's a both and, that they're going to continue to do things traditionally and they're going to try a few new things. It's like a little portfolio of experimentation over here. They really do. We use Revolution specifically. They really do want to change fundamentally how they engage. And we're really clear, I hope, in the book, and we certainly, if in the updated paperback version of the book, we add some best practice guides for certain audiences. And one of those is a best practice guide for nonprofits and fundraisers. And we make it very clear that the people who are going to be the most affected, the people working in philanthropy who are going to be the most affected by this and are going to have to pivot their work the most, are nonprofit professionals and fundraisers, because they want to be engaged in a different way, and it's often a very time intensive way. They're a lot of work. Just to be blunt about it, they can really ask a lot of your time. Just think about the impact thing. They want to see the impact. They don't like these traditions. So for example, one of the traditional things that's going to go away is the big thermometer for the campaign, right? That you define the success of the campaign by putting up a big thermometer so everybody can see how they're getting us to the goal of fundraising. And the next generation says that's not what we want. We don't want to know that the success of how we define impact is we've reached the top of the thermometer and I'm a big fat line on us getting to that thermometer. They want to know, what does that money go for?
Right.
What is the impact that's coming from that, raising that campaign dollars? How are kids being helped by this? How is the environment being improved by this? What do the numbers show of the outcome? And that's more work often for fundraisers, and they're being asked to do more of that. They also want to be engaged with organizations more on the program side than a previous donors have been. They want to be more this idea of sort of being hands off, where you write checks, and then, which is really nice often as you're a nonprofit, write checks from your big donors, and then maybe they serve on the board or something, but really they're not involved every week talking about benchmarks and what are our outcomes that we're going to achieve for this quarter. The next gen wants to be right in there, working with the program staff on how do they do those things. And that's where their relationship may be with a larger range of people in the organization, rather than just with that major gifts officer or just with the fundraiser that they have the connection to. That makes the relationship that fundraisers have with major donors more complicated. So there's a lot of ways in which I think this is really going to be complicated for the fundraising profession, especially.
Sure. More work and more complicated. And something occurred to me that I may want to circle back around to, relative to what does that look like for the nonprofit professionals, particularly most of our audience today are fundraisers. But there was something you hit on earlier. And actually, Sharna, I would like to ask you about this. And it was something that Michael alluded to, relative to it's not the same old, same old. We want to see the impact. And what are you seeing and hearing and experiencing in the field as it relates to, quite frankly, organization size and preference and the perceived nimbleness and ability to respond or not respond? What are you seeing there from our next generation of donors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think because people want to see the impact, that there is a bias towards I would say more transparent organizations. You might argue small rather than large, but I think it's not so much about size. It's more about how can we see the impact of our dollars and what our dollars are going to. So if you have a larger institution that isn't as transparent, I think that is an opportunity for growth and added communication with your next gen donors, because they want to know, if I write a check, where is this going in the organization? How are you choosing to spend your resources? Does that allocation align with my value system? They may even go to that length, right? So there's more of an expectation of financial statements being on people's websites or being easily accessible. Having the opportunity to communicate with someone on the staff, not just sort of read the metrics on Charity Navigator, but really understand. So one of our next gen donors said, who we interviewed, said, I don't want to be thought of as an ATM. And so, vice versa, like I want to have a relationship. We may court in the beginning before we, advance our relationship to marriage. We might date and get to know each other, but I want to be in communication, build the relationship, get to ask questions, understand how you're spending my resources. Another woman who we interviewed said, I wouldn't walk into a store and give the sales clerk $500 and say, pick out clothes for me.
Right. Absolutely.
So similarly, like, I'm curious, where you're allocating my resources. And she's, we got to the point, we can talk about values, but we feel really strongly that next gen donors are driven by values, and that donor in particular prioritizes effectiveness. And she said, look, I realize that not all organizations are going to measure the effectiveness of their efforts and be able to communicate that to me.
Right.
Okay, but I'm not going to invest in those organizations. So,
Sure.
it's a choice. I think if I were trying to show, the earnestness of the next gen donors, we would say, like, they're really striving to take responsibility for the privilege and resources and opportunities that they have. And that then means that they're doing their due diligence and asking questions and trying to be effective and get at root causes and, how they would translate strategic impact within philanthropy. And that's, in the best light, I think, where their high maintenance set of transparency questions are coming from when they're looking to support organizations, large or small.
Sure. No, that's great. I appreciate that. And I really love the way that you put it, that this next generation of donors is really striving to take responsibility for the privilege that they see and really making a change. And I love that. I love that. That sort of makes my whole heart swell about that. One of the things, and you did, Sharna, touch on this, and I'll throw it back either to Sharna or Michael, whoever would prefer to answer this question. Folks want to do their due diligence. They want to see financials. They want to know programmatic impact. They want to have the opportunity to talk to the major gift officer, perhaps also the program person who's putting things into place. I believe I also heard, people want to volunteer more, right? They want to be engaged and involved for their skills and their talents, and maybe marketing expert, maybe IT expert, and that from the development professionals side of the desk, so to speak. And I don't mean to make opposing sides, but rather just, from the fundraising professionals perspective, boy, that could be a lot to swallow if experts like that already exist on the staff. How does one kind of balance a donor's desire to be involved, boots on the ground, rolling up the sleeves, when in fact that may be a huge challenge, that particular skill of that particular donor prospect isn't really needed.
Yeah, and this is why we say it's could be a tremendous change, and it's going to affect the fundraising side of the work of nonprofits even more than any other piece. So just to lay out a couple of things around this. One is that you're absolutely right that, and it may be the most robust finding I think that we got from this work, where it was just so consistently found in every bit of data that we had coming in when we talked to them, when we surveyed them, and that is just how hands-on they want to be. That this idea that and again, remember, this is a generation that has more treasure than any other generation, both from their own wealth creation and from this historic wealth transfer. So wealth has been concentrating, and that wealth concentration is being transferred. And who's the beneficiaries of the historic wealth transfer? Gen Xers and millennials in the top economic level families. And so they have tremendous treasure, and they know that they have this tremendous set of resources and assets to be able to give, and they feel the obligation, as we mentioned, but they still think that their time and their talent is as important, if not more important, of an asset that they have to give. And so we have to be able to recognize that it's not as though they're going to kind of back away because they realize, oh, I may be too, putting too much pressure on people by saying you have to engage me around my talent. We call them in the book the do something generation, right? They've grown up with the volunteer opportunities from the time, and maybe even a volunteer community service requirement for their high school graduation. This is the generation that's been working hands-on from the time they were kids. And so that's how they think about good philanthropy. So we have to find a way of doing that. That doesn't mean that they're not able to be to work with those partners that they're trying to be hands-on with in a way to make sure that that's valuable. So we often heard them say, I don't want to just be given token volunteer responsibilities. We had one person who say, I don't want to be asked to decide the color of the napkins for the annual gala.
Right.
I don't want to go to the ladies' tea stuffing envelopes kind of thing. I don't have time for that. And I've got a lot of skills that I can contribute beyond that. And so they really want to be, it's not just do anything, even if they want to do something, they don't want to just do anything. But once they start giving, as you say, that talent, there is a moment where they want to be really deeply involved. And if they see that their contribution to their talent is really not necessary, or it's going to take the organization in some direction that's going to be a lot of investment and time and energy just to make them as the donor happy, they are, especially the ones who are involved over time and they become more savvy, they get to a point where they can see when that's happening. We call it the bull in the china shop problem that often happens with the next generation, especially those who've been really successful in business and they're entrepreneurs, and they're now come in and they say, I'm going to come in and do great things for this organization because I've been able to do that in my career. They often at the beginning of that engagement, we see these problems like you're talking about that happen more, where they begin to ask, let's try these new things, or bring me in and let me be your IT person, or whatever it might be. And the organization has to say, well, let's negotiate, let's talk that through. But what mitigates against that problem, what helps people get through it, is that they want to be involved deeply. Mm-hmm. And as they become involved deeply, they want a candid, long-term relationship. As that evolves, they begin to see, oh, well, me asking you for that maybe isn't the right thing for the organization. And they begin to get to that point. So I think the solution for this problem is more engagement, right? And John Dewey once said that the solution for the problems of democracy is more democracy. The solution for the problems of engaging the next generation that might come from that is more engagement with the next generation. But that's why it's so much work.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And Sharna, it looked like you were about, did you want to?
Well, just to underscore two takeaways, I think, in what Michael's saying. One is that you can ask them what they want to do.
Say that again. Wait. Say that again.
You can ask them what they want to do. Right, because I think we assume, oh, well, I have the board and maybe I have this committee. Particularly women told us they often get funneled onto the fundraising committee. But if we ask them, how would you want to be involved? They tell us. And to me, the benefit of that is that we don't get turned down for the board and then never see them again and not know really what happened. Right? We get a better fit. And to underscore another point Michael made, candor is appreciated. So if you can't do something because what they're requesting takes you out of mission, they'd rather just hear that. Right? One donor said to me, don't say like, well, we'll think about it and get back to you, to be polite. Just tell me, this would actually take us out of mission. I don't think it's the right fit. Or if you contributed an extra 50,000, then we could add this program on because we could hire a staff person for it. But otherwise, I don't have the resources now to do that. Right. So candor.
Ask the donors what they need, express if the organization then expresses what they need, and it is a true negotiation and meeting of the minds to get what is mutually satisfactory, mutually beneficial, and really feels good and works for everybody. I think that's what I hear.
Can I just piggyback on that a little bit? So yes, you want to ask them what they need, but we've had a few people say that they'd rather be asked, because for them, sometimes when they're asked, what do you need? They begin to think of that like a transaction. Like, okay, what do you need in order for us to get you to give us this big check?
Right.
Right. And for them, they say, they would say, I wanted people to ask me what I value. What do I care about?
I love that.
What matters to, what is the impact I want to see in the world? And and having that conversation is where they really want to thrive. And then all the other stuff follows from that. And so if you ask the next gen, I think that we talk to, certainly what they want to be asked by fundraisers, it's what do you care about? What matters to you? What makes your heart sing?
I love that. I love that. Such a good way to think about it. One of the things, and I want to, again, you all inspire so many questions in my own mind. I want to make sure we have time for the questions that are coming in. But one of the things, Sharna, that you brought up relative to this whole conversation about how do these folks want to be involved? How does the next generation of philanthropists want to be involved? There seemed to be an aversion to being asked to fundraise, not just color of napkins, but an aversion to being asked to fundraise. But the but that I also read in the book is they still want to be connected with their peers in giving. And can you expand a little bit more on what that means and how it reflects kind of on the overall tenor? You know, they still want to be with their peers, but they don't necessarily want to be the lead in the campaign or some other fundraising initiative.
Yeah, this is a multi-layered question.
I know.
It reminds me, so I peeked at the questions in the Q&A, and John asked a good one about how does this higher level of engagement square with the concept of trust-based philanthropy? And I think that we started to get at that in our last, back and forth. Yeah. But the donors who we've interviewed, I mean, we did a webinar with including Andrew Dayton, who started Constellation Fund in the Twin Cities. I know some of you are here from those cities, probably know of Constellation Fund, and he was pretty clear. I'm using his name because he was public in saying this, that he said, I didn't grow up in poverty, right? And so I don't understand the needs on the ground in the same way as our local partners do. And so I'd really try to listen and trust what their needs are in informing what Constellation Fund supports. And I think that that I would extend that to the fundraising piece, that if you can be in communication with your next gen donors, they are really, they'll tell you what they value and what kind of change they want to see in the world, to Michael's point, but then they're looking to you to say, well, here's how we think it's best to achieve that. Right? Because we're on the ground working on these issues. We've done the research, we have the track record, and so forth and so on. And so here's how we think we can have an impact and would like your help working on that, right? So I think that's the door to say, would you make a lead gift? Would you talk to your peers about it? Like, this would make a difference if you're ready to show up in this way, tying it to the mission and the need and the impact that the organization has. So building that trust about knowing they're looking to you to be the on the ground experts, and showing how those are levers, to pull to deepen that impact. The other piece that you brought up is really peerage. And I do think that, we're talking about 20s, 30s, and 40s. So there is a great range, but particularly in the younger donors we are talking about, they haven't yet found their lifetime advisors. They don't all yet have their trust and estate attorneys and their accountants and their financial people or their philanthropic advisors who advise them on their giving. And so that compounded with growing up in a society where they look horizontally for all of their research, right? If they want to go to a restaurant, they read the Yelp reviews. If they want to buy a product, they read the Amazon reviews. Like, they are looking to peers for their advice and support as they're getting into this field. And so they very much use it for input, for strategy, for inspiration, for connections. It is a piece of their communications and dynamics. And they know the power of it. So maybe in the beginning, as they're getting their footholds, they might not want to step out front to be the leader there, but I do think they know the power of ties. They don't use them quid pro quo like previous generations. They use them for strategy and impact. And so if you can respect them that way,
right,
then
right.
they're bringing something to the end of of strategy and impact.
Right, right. So rather than saying, will you introduce us to your friends? How, perhaps something like, how is this valued among your peer group? Or, just to sort of bring the conversation so that the donor, the younger donors in particular, know that you understand ties are important to them and have that conversation, but not necessarily we're asking you to open the door.
One of my clients, a young woman who I help on philanthropic advising, says she's more comfortable calling herself a friend raiser than a fundraiser. That she would love for the organization she supports, if they're having an event that demonstrates the strategic impact they're having in the community, to allow her to bring people to that event to see the impact, as we were talking about earlier, rather than saying, here, let me like turn her over to you for a lunch, to get let me friend raise, let me build that relationship with you.
I would say I would add two things to this too that we clearly come out and I think are more kind of specific tips you can think about. One is, if you're thinking about it, like you said, instead of asking them, can you introduce me to your friends? You can maybe say, remember, they really want to give talent. They really want to help solve problems, roll up their sleeves. Say, here's a problem we're thinking about, or we're thinking about this new idea. There's a population we want to serve that we're not able to serve right. Would you want to pull together a task force of you and your friends and your peers to think about how we can help address this, right? And they often really like that. That's also, by the way, a way in which larger institutions can make themselves feel smaller and show that more specific impact is, instead of, can you just be a drop in this big bucket for our capital campaign? Rather, you say, hey, here's one piece of this campaign where we're really looking at the best way of doing this piece of this work. Can you bring your talents and your treasure to bear on solving this problem with us, with your peer? That's the great way, because then they're working together with their peers around talent. And the second thing is, they really, one of the things that I think is a harsh truth for many people, but it's certainly something we found over and over again, is that the next generation trusts information that comes from peers, perhaps more than they trust information that comes from the organization itself. And so they really, so if they're, the old style peer fundraising was, okay, well, you give to the Heart Association because I'm on their board, and I'll give the United Way because you're on that board. Or then when they first go to an organization and you decide whether you can trust it, you look at who's on the board and, okay, well, those are community leaders. And well, now what they want, they would love it if they can, somebody that they know or that they might know, but they feel it's sort of a peer in their community, relates to them this incredibly authentic, powerful experience that they had partnering in a deep way with an organization. That's going to be really powerful for them. And it's going to make them kind of their ears prick up and their interest in this organization much more than reading a really cool story in an annual report, or going to a website or going to a gala and seeing, they like the galas for the social side, but seeing the sort of organizational produced evidence and arguments for why you should support us, having their peers share a real experience with them is very powerful. So they trust that information a lot.
I love to hear that maybe, like you say, there's Yelp for restaurants, or whatever it is that folks check into for the horizontal advice and strategy. So what I hear you saying, and this is donor focused, but it's also fundraising professional focused. What I hear you saying is there's going to be a lot more investment of time on the part of the organization's existing volunteers, fundraising staff, potentially also programmatic staff, which, quite frankly, knowing that this generation of donors is the recipient of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth ever, there could be a real case then to be made that we organizations need to invest more deeply, more heavily in the professional development of our fundraising professionals. We need to make sure that we hire more, because our donors are going to ask more of us. And to put it in a very dollars and cents kind of a way, the return on investment is likely to be extraordinary if we can engage with the people who are coming up and going to make the decisions about, if some of them are 20, going to be making the philanthropic decisions for the next, 60 years.
Right.
If we want to get ahead of this, if we want to be participatory, we've got to invest in our team, in our internal team, whether it's volunteers or staff. Is that fair?
I think you're completely right. And I feel, I almost feel badly hearing you talk about it and saying it, because I know nonprofits are so stretched and resources are scarce. And so the idea of like investing more in their own organizational capacity is not always the first instinct, because you want to push the money out the door. But I
Right.
couldn't agree more with you that, you know, we're the opportunity, let me say it this way, the opportunity here is that next gen donors are not waiting till the sunset of their lives to retire into philanthropic leisure and make their legacy gifts. They're starting, to Sally's question, I think they are starting at earlier stages. We hear from estate planners that the greatest mode of giving estate gifts right now is people in their 40s.
Yeah.
I think they grew up in a time where the wealth transfer research was apparent. They didn't wait till, you know, their parents passed to have the conversation about how to prepare for their resources if they're inheritors. And so I think they're, you know, and the needs are great. And so they're, as Michael said earlier, they're really thinking about all these issues at earlier ages and stages and want to be active in this. And so it's our opportunity to open our shops and to have these candid conversations and see how we can get them involved. And to your point, the return on investment will hopefully be for decades to come.
Right. Right.
If we don't build it now, it's going to be hard later to turn someone on to a major gift without having had the on-ramp
Right.
to our relationship and to smaller gifts that would increase to that major gift if we don't start now to build that.
Exactly. But that can be, I think what I'm hearing you say also, Sharna, is that can be a bit of a big pill for an organization to swallow. Okay, so if these folks have the capacity now, but they're not going to invest in what we organization might imagine would be the same time frame or the same pace with a significant gift that previous generations will, what's the lead time look like, you know? And so we've got to really be focused and intentional to prepare ourselves for the next decades to come. So yeah.
Yes, but it's also not as far out, I think, as people also imagine. I mean, Michael and I just did this survey, gosh, was it last summer already, about how next gen donors were responding to COVID and the other crises of the year. And really we heard people in a different way saying there's an urgency and there's a need, and this is not to be put off, right? Even if we usually spend a year thinking about our philanthropic strategy and how we want to allocate our resources, we don't have time for that now. We need to move resources out the door and in a bigger way than ever before. And so I think that this is an interesting moment where people really stepped up, younger ages, greater amounts, reducing the hoops that nonprofits had to jump through in order to gain access to those resources. And so they're a bit more, I think, open to having that kind of conversation. You know, Michael and I just read this study from another organization that talked about Gen Xers within 25 years will be the major wealth holders and philanthropic decision makers. So we're not that far out.
Yeah, I think
absolutely.
To this question of time horizon, it's a really important one, because I think, you know, a lot of organizations have a pretty short time horizon on that return on investment question that you raised, right? Like if we're doing professional development, if we're committing, you know, new staff time and resources to our development side of the shop, or any of that stuff that you invest in the fundraising work, we want a return on investment on that in a year, 2 years. Like we want and with the next generation, what Sharna was just saying is really important. They are really eager to be involved and to start moving money. And we saw that in 2020, and they really want to be active, but they're still probably not going to be your biggest check writers or however people transfer funds to nonprofits these days in preferred way. They're not going to be your biggest number donors for a while. Some of them will be, but others, they're going to be tremendous donors in the future, but they're not there yet. And so you have to think in your time horizon a bit. It's this complicated kind of dual time horizon now, where you need to think about getting them engaged right now in a short term, but you want to measure your ROI perhaps of that engagement in a longer way. What also encourages this is, remember, we've been saying over and over again, they want to be deeply involved in organizations, and they want to be involved in these organizations right now, that they can develop that relationship over time. And we had people who told us, you know, I often will volunteer for an organization for a few years just to see what it's like. And they have no idea that I'm going to inherit this money in 10, 15 years. Maybe their prospect research tells them that, but in many cases they don't. Or they say, we had one person say, I was involved in an organization. They were in my estate plan that I've got through my family's lawyers and everything. But my experience with them was not great. And so I took them out of my estate plan.
Sure.
So they are right now very much, many of the donors that are going to be the big next gen donors that are going to be their major contributors higher than any other previous generations for the next several decades are perhaps already small annual donors to your organization or volunteers for your organization right now. And they're looking for those ways of being engaged. And so building up your fundraising capacity to do that kind of engagement with the next generation may pay off in 20 years in a tremendous way.
Excellent. So we know folks want to be much more engaged. If we invest now, we are likely to have, extraordinary returns in a short term, but also in a much longer time horizon with our next generation donors. This has really been an exciting discussion, and I don't want to cut it too short, but I do know that we have a couple of additional, and Sharna, you've been checking out the questions as we go along. I wonder if now we want to just take a quick breath and ask our dear friend Bill, who's moderating our questions, to pop on. And Bill, what are you seeing in our little Q&A box that we want to make sure that we draw to Sharna and Michael's attention?
Well, we've covered most of what the questions have, but there's two specific ones I think are still outstanding. And Michael, you alluded to this. Will these new donors change the way we accept gifts? Example, will they accept cryptocurrency in the future?
Yeah, so this, I think we don't, as a researcher, I have to say we don't have enough data to know just how much they're going to want to make gifts with cryptocurrency. What we do know is that they want to push innovation and they want to try new things. And so if there's going to be any group that really pushes the idea of making gifts in cryptocurrency, it's going to be next generation donors. And many of them, with tremendous resources from things like crypto. The one thing I would caution on this is that for some of them, yes, it's going to be, how cool is it that I can make this crypto donation? And that was how I was contributing. But that's not like they're going to then fall back into the old standard where they say, like their crypto donation was just like an old check writing thing where it's all about the money and all about the transaction and the details of the transaction. And that what matters to me. And then you guys go and take that money from crypto and do whatever you want with it. They're still going to want to be involved in the organization in the same way. They're still going to want to, be hands-on, give their talent, go deep with the organization and give through their values and be committed to mission and see impact. All those things we've been talking about. Just the nature of the transaction is not necessarily going to be different when they. It's not going to change how they want to engage with the organization. I think that's really important to point out.
I don't want to miss the obvious, which is just that next gen are going to an organization's website first when they're thinking about that. So if we're not up to speed on sort of having the basic content on the website about, what's the mission, here's how you get the financials, here's who you write to answer my questions, and if you can make a donation online, that will kick them out. So we just want to make sure everyone's at least up to speed there.
Right.
And I would say with your events, millennials are expecting now to text their donation, not just write a check and leave it on the table at your events. So I think, if you can add some new mechanisms for funding and events too, they're looking to do digital in the moment as well, even if they're in person at an event,
Right.
not at home.
So Tony asked, how are we seeing the rise of mutual aid impact tendencies of giving among these donors?
So again, this is one of those where it's, we would have to do some more detailed research specifically on how they approach mutual aid. But I will say that 2020 was really a good window into this because as we all know, there was a lot of things that happened in 2020 that looked a lot like mutual aid. Neighbors helping neighbors, and sort of people creating systems by which they can help others that with whatever they need. That's it's not through formal organizations, but more neighbor to neighbor and peer to peer. There's somebody that we talked to, and it was a next gen that we answered our survey, and we also talked to him about setting up like within his town, him putting his resources as a relatively major donor, putting his resources in to set up the system by which people could connect to each other, peer to peer, neighbor to neighbor, or stranger to stranger around a specific in-kind kind of giving in that community. And so he, as a donor, figured he could front the cost of setting up a system like that so that would work. And so I think and we did hear a lot of people in 2020, especially from the next gen, saying, well, I leaned into some of the other ways in which I could give, making masks or setting up peer conversations about how do we meet the needs within our community, how do we provide for it, rather than just what they also did, which was give a lot of money and get the money out the door quickly and try to make it easier for people to get that money. They did see the value of mutual aid as a response to 2020. So I think that's positive. But when we're talking about the major donors, they're still thinking very much about long-term. They don't want mutual aid to be kind of episodic and quick, but they do see the value in in-kind giving and in peer-to-peer giving for sure when it's necessary. But they're thinking bigger also than that.
And the way I think about it is those kind of donors are interested in enhancing the quality of life in their community. So it's always about the higher vision. It's not the act of giving.
Yeah.
It's the result of what happens when we give.
Yep. But they are focused on local giving. One of the things, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but it's important that, one of the things we hear a lot about the next generation is that, well, they're going to be more interested in international and global issues because they can get more information than ever before because of the world we live in about these global issues. So they know about hunger in Thailand or struggles in the Sudan, human rights struggles in the Sudan, and rather than necessarily, maybe they may know more about that than they know about hunger in their town or human rights struggles in their state. And so they're going to want to give to these global issues, and that's going to be a challenge for those who try to raise money and work in local nonprofits, local causes. And we certainly found that that's not the case. They're interested in those international issues. They give for those, but what mitigates against that is they want to be hands-on, they want to see impact, and they really are committed to local giving. And so I think that's good news for those folks who are place-based in the nonprofit work that you do and community-oriented in your fundraising. The next gen really still wants to be involved in local giving, which is somewhat different than maybe some of the perceptions that people have of growing up in a global world as they are.
Well, Cynthia asked, she's been hearing about historic wealth transfer for almost 40 years. Will we still be talking about this phenomenon in the next 40 years?
I'm chuckling at your question. So, Paul Shervish and John Havens from Boston College Center for Wealth and Philanthropy, I think first came out with the wealth transfer research in 1998. So we're, 23 years into a 50-year horizon on their research for the wealth transfer. And I don't know, Michael, you remember the date better than I did, but then they did a refresh of that before Paul retired. So I do think we're actually still amid the 50-year wealth transfer that they were talking about. We have about 30 to go. And it's generational, right? So we're talking about 20 years of a generation. Traditionalists have already started to pass to baby boomers, and now we're seeing baby boomers start to transfer their wealth and their charitable during lifetime and bequests to Gen Xers and millennial children and grandchildren.
So this may be a good question to wrap this part of the webinar up with. Is in your book you talk about this next few years being the golden age of fundraising. So I'm going to ask you to kind of predict. Do you think the golden age will really occur?
Michael will tell you I'm one of the most optimistic people in the field. Maybe as someone who's a next gen donor herself, who feel like, I didn't earn the wealth that I have the opportunity to steward at the foundation my great uncle set up. And so I feel this great opportunity to move those resources out the door to where the needs are great. And find a lot of my peers on a similar journey of figuring out their philanthropic identity and making a meaningful impact in the world. So yes, I am hopeful and optimistic about that golden age of giving.
Good.
Love that.
Well, and if I could just, it's funny you should ask, because I wrote something for the Chronicle last fall that was that essentially asked the question, we keep hearing that this is the second golden age, right, of giving, and that we're in a new golden age of giving, and that's for good reason, because this wealth concentration that leads to the wealth transfer. That's why the wealth transfer, we keep talking about it, is because wealth keeps concentrating and it's being transferred. And so there is just tremendous amounts of attention and resources. We are in a time when where in the gold sense of the golden age, it certainly is a golden age. But the message of that piece was, if we want it to truly be a golden age, we've got to take our work seriously. We've got to take the work of trying to move that historic amount of money in ways that really that follow some of the tenets and great work that's being done now under the rubric of trust-based philanthropy, that changes how we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, and the way that we use these historic amounts of resources, that brings the next generation in a way that really is meaningful to them and that keeps them involved. So there's a lot of challenges that we have. Simply, it won't be a golden age simply because there's a lot of gold. It has to be a golden age because we respond in the right way. And I think having conversations like this one and having the conversations that we're having in the field now about just what a special opportunity this is, but what kind of the big challenges are that we're facing now, I think that's the story that we're all a part of right now. And we can all be a part of making it the golden age, I guess.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank both of you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I'm afraid we're running up against the clock, and I wish we could continue on for another 60 minutes. This has been so enlightening and well, you've pulled back the curtain. There is a lot of mystery among our peers in the fundraising profession. And so you've really given us a peek inside as to what this golden age can look like if we apply ourselves in the right way. So I want to thank you, Sharna and Michael. And I want to thank all of our guests here on our webinar. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your insightful questions. We hope you've enjoyed yourselves and that you feel enthusiastic about how you'll have the opportunity to help these donors be their best and help you be your best as well. Thank you again. Next month in October, we'll be hosting our second On Giving, and that will be October the 12th. I hope you'll join us. And to be the follow-on to Sharna and Michael, we've got Dr. Beth Breeze coming. Beth is the Director of Global Challenges, Doctoral Center, and Director of the Center for Philanthropy Reader in Social Policy at the University of Kent in the UK. Among Beth's publications is The New Fundraisers, who organizes charitable giving in contemporary society. It is the first empirically grounded and theorized account of the identity, characteristics, and motivation of fundraisers. So for those of you who are interested in recruitment and retention, this may be interesting. She also writes and speaks extensively on the defense of philanthropy and the logic of charity. She'll be coming out with a new book that we'll be discussing as well. So I hope you'll come and enjoy this as much as you did as our conversation with Sharna and Michael. I can't thank you all enough. It's been fantastic. So before I go, I want to say a couple of quick things. Not just the people on the screen are the ones who made it happen. Sarah Southwood of 2164 assisted us so much in coordinating for today. Bill Mulvihill, of course, you saw, was our question moderator, and our senior consultant, Aaron Simon, and executive assistant, Sam Martin, were here for technical support. So Sharna and Michael, thank you again. We hope to have another conversation again with you soon, and we appreciate everything that you've done. Go forth, do good work. Philanthropy is a powerful force for good.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.